Zedd gives Richard the baldric for the sword, but it is too small for him. Zedd takes Richard and Kahlan to the edge of the grass next to 2 rock maple trees. One as thick as Richard's wrist, and one as thick as Kahlan's wrist. Richard later mentions seeing Zedd plant and care for those trees, but we're not given a timeline as to when they were planted. Zedd tells Richard he's going to show him the most important thing about the sword, but he needs him to take back the Sword of Truth and abdicate his position of Seeker to Kahlan. While Zedd directs the course of events, notice even for the purposes of demonstration, he still follows what he said in the previous chapter about the Seeker being allowed to be the Seeker until they choose not to be. He motions for Richard to give Kahlan the sword, and Richard decides to play along. Being a stickler for ceremony and tradition, Zedd waves his hands in a flourish over her and formally names her the Seeker of Truth. The sword feels heavy in her hands, and she lets the tip rest on the ground. Zedd tells Kahlan a story about Dark and Rawl's malicious tree-planting ways, saying the bigger tree was put there next to the smaller one by him to make him easy to find and kill at a time of his choosing. He tells her it's the same Dark and Rawls who was hunting her and killed her sister. Hate fills Kahlan's eyes, and Zedd tells her to cut down the tree to stop Dark and Rawl. It works. With a single swing of the sword, Kahlan slashes the Sword of Truth through the tree, shattering at the point of impact, leaving only a ragged stump to remain as the rest of the tree crashes down nearby. He does this by triggering her anger, by repeating, it's the same Dark and Rawl who hunts her. It's the same Dark and Rawl who killed her friends and family. And if Zedd wanted to, in that moment, he could have made her believe it was the same Dark and Rawl who crashed a bus full of nuns into an even bigger bus full of nuns before using the explosives to blow them all straight into heaven the hard way. After the tree is destroyed, Kahlan can no longer hold herself up and collapses to the ground. She gives back the Sword of Truth and sets 2 new world records, the first being the longest-serving combination Mother, Confessor, and Seeker of Truth, the second for the shortest-serving term as Seeker of Truth. Take your wins where you can get them. Richard asks Zedd, what's this all about then? And tells him he knows Dark and Rawl had nothing to do with planting those trees there. And Zedd pulls the old, don't worry about it, go cut down the smaller tree routine. And it works. Richard takes a mighty swing against the tree, only to have the air in front of him become thicker than a mouthful of honey and caramels. He tries again and gives up after the sword is unable to touch the tree. Richard asks Zedd again, what's all this about then? Zedd tells Richard when Kahlan cut down her tree, it would have made no difference if it were made of steel instead of wood, and the sword would have cut through it just as well. Zedd says that reality isn't relevant, and perception is everything. If you think it's an enemy, you can destroy it, whether true or not. It won't allow you to harm someone you think is innocent, but it will destroy whoever you perceive to be an enemy within your own limits. Only what you believe and not the truth of your thoughts is the determining factor. Richard is worried about this and says, what if you aren't sure? And Zedd finishes the second half of his warning about what happens if he gets it wrong. Zedd says, you'd better be sure, my boy, or you're liable to find yourself in a lot of trouble. The magic could read things in your mind you're not even aware of. It could go either way. You could kill a friend, or fail to kill a foe. He also tells Richard the only thing he can do, he needs to get it right, and he needs to remember how important it is that he get it right, because how he feels is not an escape from the laws of cause and effect. Zedd tells Richard, using the Sword of Truth to kill an enemy comes with a price, and the more powerful the enemy, the higher the price. Zedd says, killing follows the same rules anger does. He says, sometimes it's the right answer. It's a terrible thing. It cannot be undone. And you pay a price for having done it. It diminishes you as a human. Zedd goes on to say the magic of the Sword of Truth exacts a price. Zedd tells Richard humans are creatures of balance, and there's no such thing as good who is completely devoid of evil, nor is there a person who is evil completely devoid of good. Zedd says his cat eats mice, and while both he and the cat are fine with that, the mice would have a different point of view. Richard says it's crazy because Dark and Rawl killed his father and wants to subjugate everyone, and he just wants to lead a quiet life as a woods guide, and Zedd is making Dark and Rawl sound like him instead of a dangerous person. Zedd addresses Richard's concerns using a combination of Wizard's first rule and the conservation of cognitive dissonance by accusing Richard of not paying attention to what he's saying, instead telling him he isn't understanding it. Richard answers Zedd in a quiet voice. She was able to do it because she thought she was right. After Richard says this, Zedd pulls the old switcheroo when he says, because Richard said it, it must be true. And it works. From Zedd's perspective, Richard is made better by this application of cognitive violence, and the justification for Zedd's actions is explained just a few paragraphs earlier when he says, you had better be sure or you're liable to find yourself in a lot of trouble. Zedd warns Richard Darkenral is more dangerous because he firmly believes he is right. Richard says, you mean it's not only what he does which makes him dangerous, but also that he feels justified in doing? And Zedd tells him a parable about some stolen bread and a stolen baby. Richard gets the point when he says, even if this woman was wrong about his baby stealing ways, she would be a terrifying force because her actions would have the full weight of her conviction behind them. Zedd gives Richard the cue to say his next line when he says, Darkenral thinks he's right, implying he can win because of this. He also tells Richard exactly how to deliver his line by using a fierce expression when he says it. This prompts Richard to respond to cognitive dissonance in an equal and opposite amount when he says he is in the right with an equally fierce expression. Richard uncrosses his arms and finally allows himself to internalize the words. He says he doesn't like it, but he understands the message. Not wanting to dwell any longer, Richard takes Zedd's previous advice about walking backwards into the future by needing to have his feelings fully validated before he can process, and asks what Zedd is talking about when he says there's a price for using the sword of truth. Zedd tells Richard using the sword to kill forces the wielder to see all of the evil in himself and all of the good in the one they killed, and the magic makes it worse, punishing the body and the soul. The pain is described as very real, very powerful, having real and devastating effects. But Zedd says it comes from the self as well as the magic. Zedd says, the more powerful the enemy, the more powerful the pain. Zedd says rage is the only defense against the machine that is the naked truth of the destruction which has occurred. And the stronger the rage, the stronger the shield against that pain. Zedd tells Richard he wouldn't have given him the sword if he wasn't able to use his anger because the magic would tear him apart if he did. Richard stares off into the sunset and then ponders the encroaching darkness that is coming for all of them. Determined to find a way across the boundary, Richard accepts the sword will help him, and that is all that matters. He accepts there's a cost to everything in life, and he is willing to pay this one. Because Zedd has a deep understanding of prophecy, he puts his hand on Richard's shoulders in preparation to shake some sense into him. Because time is short, Zedd has no choice but to ruin Richard's catharsis of character growth by dropping another truth bomb on him when he says, you aren't going to like this, but you can't use the sword of truth on Darkenral. While Zedd is literally shaking some sense into Richard, he tells him the magic of Orden protects him, and if he tries to use the sword on him, he will be dead before it reaches him. When Richard interjects again about how unfair that is, Zedd tells him he doesn't make the rules, he only knows how they work, and if Richard ignores his warning and tries, he will die. Kahlan says they can't do it because the sword is his most important weapon, and it is definitely very important because the sword of truth is his most important weapon. And before she can say anything else, Zedd roughly lays hands on Richard's head and jabs him a bunch of times, saying the Seeker's brains and his heart are his most important weapon. And if you remember from earlier, Zedd also mentions having the courage to face his fears and the courage to be the kind of person who will get it right, so that his mind is no longer the servant to the whims of his emotion. And if you combine this with Richard's repeated wishes to return home, to his simple home in Heartland, this makes Richard the entire cast of The Wizard of Oz. And Brophy is Toto. Zedd says the sword is just a tool and he can find another way. In a rare miss, Zedd misreads the situation and starts to pour on another round of the wizard's fourth rule, mixed with a dose of correlation without causation, when he starts to equate being on Richard's side with him being right. I'm sorry, my boy, I wish I could change the magic, but Richard tells Zedd that the truth is what matters, and at least for the moment, his ability to think is fully within his control instead of under the whim of his emotions. He says, titles, the sword, magic, all of it are a means to an end. That's all. Zedd immediately proves he can congratulate someone without hitting them when he pats himself on the back for choosing such a great seeker. Kahlan apologizes for cutting down Zedd's tree because she found out that it was planted in memory of his dead wife instead of a large covert homing beacon tree placed by Dark and Rahl to find the old wizard, even though other powerful magic prevents anyone from remembering what his name is or what he looks like. And even though Zedd has the knowledge of this tree somehow, and it is the only direct link and singular tie to his existence Dark and Rahl is aware of, he somehow decided the safest way to protect himself would be to build the only house for miles that would be visible from this tree and be within walking distance of Dark and Rahl's homing beacon trees. Richard finally starts acting like things are serious when he ignores Kahlan's judgment has been clouded by an intense but temporary bloodlust for murdering trees, preferring to think of the solution instead. Richard's train of thought starts out strong when he thinks about the problem of how to cross the boundary, twice, before repeatedly asking himself if they were going to die because it was impossible. Richard tries to figure out if it's even possible, and something in Richard's mind tells him it is, insisting it could be done, insisting he knows the truth of it. Once again, Richard's gift gives him a gentle nudge to let him know he's on the right track. In a moment of clarity, Richard communes with nature harder than Disney's Pocahontas during her waterfall swan dive. With mountains on his mind, he thinks about crossing over more times than a professional John Edwards impersonator before he realizes there must be a pass because the Book of Counted Shadows is magic, and it couldn't have been there before the boundary came up. Just to be sure, he asks Zedd to swear to him twice that he has never sent anyone through the boundary and that no one but a wizard like Dark and Rahl would be able to do it. After getting Zedd all worked up by not telling him what's going on, Richard gets the answer he needs and proceeds to ignore his grandfather when he asks him 3 different ways if he's come up with a solution. Richard instead realizes that because his father got the Book of Counted Shadows to him, he must have been able to leave Westland to do so. Because Zedd was the only creature of magic in Westland, his father would have needed help to do it. And because Zedd said he never helped anyone, that means his father must have found a pass since they had no magic to help him pass through. Richard ignores all of this and tells everyone what to do when the next words out of his mouth are, "We will go have supper." And it works. Kahlan gets excited about bread, and Zedd swears about finally being validated by someone else thinking about dinner for him. While Zedd is basking in the moment of validation, Richard takes advantage of his malleable state and says after dinner they're going to pack and set out for the Midlands tomorrow morning. And it works! With some stew in his belly, Zedd remembers Richard thinks he has it all figured out and asks him to tell everyone what he knows. But Richard plays hard to get when he answers Zedd with a riddle. Kahlan feeds someone else's pet, and Zedd asks Richard how he knows there's a way across. Zedd pulls the old, "look at me, I'm an old man, and we're best friends, and we shouldn't be keeping secrets from one another" routine, and Richard is in no mood for any of that noise when he says he's had more honesty from strangers. Because he is right, both Zedd and Kahlan take the win and let their curiosity go, because having the answer they need is more important than understanding what the answer they is. Richard isn't messing around about keeping his secrets to himself for now, and gets back to the task of preparing provisions for their travel to the Midlands. Richard asks Kahlan what's with the dress, and she tells him it's how people recognize her, and everywhere she goes she is provided food and lodging. Richard makes the point of it not being the best idea to wear something so readily identifiable and memorable while they're being hunted, and she's happily able to follow along with his advice because traveling through the wilderness during the fall in a dress makes her cold. Having gotten away with feeding another person's pet a small scrap of food, Kahlan escalates the behavior of feeding it an entire meal of her leftover stew. Richard leads the discussion on what to take and what to do with and without. Dinner is interrupted when Zedd's cat starts sensing something unfamiliar and reacts by raising its fur. All 3 of them get up. Richard looks out the window to see what's going on, and Zedd goes to the front door with Kahlan in tow. Richard uses his senses that he has access to gather more information by looking out the window. And true as toasted toads, I guarantee that Zedd already had his magic sense activated before any of them even stood up. Kahlan places her trust in Zedd and follows him outside. When they all make it outside, there's a group of approximately 50 men. They have torches and weapons and are described as still being in their work clothes. Richard looks into their faces and sees what his logic and reason tell him is a group of hard-working and honest men. His senses give him a different perspective. In this moment, they are not the kind people he knows, but rather an angry, dangerous, superstitious, and cowardly lot. Zedd takes the lead and does not engage them directly by challenging their presence on his property. Instead, he asks them, "What's all this then, boys?" John, a man Richard recognizes, steps forward and tells Zedd that there's trouble caused by magic, and he's at the bottom of it. John calls him a witch. Poor, foolish John has just given Zedd everything he needs to redirect his own cognitive dissonance back onto itself. John doubles down and repeats what he said and tells Richard and Kahlan not to worry about it, or he will be forced to do to them what they intend to do to Zedd if they don't walk away. Kahlan tells the men to leave and that they'll regret it if they don't listen, which they take as a sign of encouragement. They laugh at her, become more confident in their position, and declare her to be a witch, equally deserving of what they're planning for Zedd. Richard realizes that by engaging with him the way she has, the men are strengthened and energized. He steps in front, pushing Kahlan and Zedd back. Richard starts out strong when he asks John in a calm and friendly voice, how is Sarah? And establishes that he knows many of them to be good men. Richard doesn't know it, but he is effective in lowering the temperature of the room. Then he tells them this isn't something they want to do, and that they should go home and be with their families instead. John tells Richard to leave before he decides to rope him in with Zedd and Kahlan. The mob pushes forward and Richard draws the sword of truth. Collectively, the men experience a jolt of intuition when they have no choice but to recognize they are in mortal danger. The moment of hesitation only lasts a moment for the mob because their metric for making decisions, feeling good, tells them that they must be right because they believe they are right. Richard uses the sword to destroy John's weapon, splintering it with a loud crack. Richard uses the sword and the threat of violence to make everyone back up. In this moment, the force of Richard's words creates a more powerful feeling than the one which was causing them to press forward. The men might not realize it, but Richard is too much for them to ever handle, especially if Zedd uses his gift to get involved. John says they can't stop all of them, and while they're just trying to save their families, Richard follows his instincts and angrily presents logical evidence that they're trying to hurt someone who has repeatedly been there for them. He tries to turn the mood of the crowd by putting his sword away, while he continues his logically rooted arguments. This doesn't work because John keeps telling Richard he cares about Zedd being a witch, and Richard keeps telling John he shouldn't care about the thing he cares about because Zedd is a good person and has helped them in the past. They think magic is dangerous for their families and is bad. Zedd has magic. That means he's a witch, and it's their job to protect their families by saving them from the evil magic man. Zedd steps in finally because this is the moment he was waiting for. Richard notices Zedd is amused by all of this. He pulls Richard and Kahlan aside and asks them to watch and learn. Zedd greets the men politely, saying, "Gentlemen, good evening. How nice to see you all." Goodkind sneaks in a quick demonstration of the conservation of cognitive dissonance when some of the men feel compelled to greet him despite their position that they will be murdering him soon. Much like Bugs Bunny giving Elmer Fudd a birthday cake holding a stick of dynamite, Zedd pulls the old, "Since you are going to kill me anyway, can I convince you to feel a little better about the whole unjustly murdering me thing by asking for a completely reasonable and seemingly inconsequential request?" And it works. Zedd tells Kahlan that she was using too little force, and the end result would have ended in them being destroyed. Then he tells Richard that even though he's able to overpower the situation by force, it would be using an atomic bomb when a slingshot would have achieved the same result. Zedd gives them both a pat on the head when he says they tried their best, but it's time for the master to show them how to make this group of angry men listen. Zedd leaves Richard and Kahlan to wonder what he's talking about while he smiles and waves to the angry mob, asking John how the little girl he saved in the middle of the night was doing between now and when Zedd saved her from death by exposure or animal attack. Says that she's fine now, but recently a two-headed calf was born, and that's proof that Zedd is a witch, and therefore a danger to their families. Zedd pulls the old, "Before you're going to kill me, you have to use the proper words to nail my gender and mystical identity, or else people will think you're a fool," trick on them. And it works. Zedd proceeds to ask them what they think someone with magic would be capable of. The men offer a few weak suggestions, but because Zedd continues to withhold validation from them about any of it sounding dangerous, they're compelled to chase the feeling by offering even more reasons they're confident Zedd will leave them with no choice but to agree with them. Zedd gives the men what they say they want when he agrees with every crazy and a half-baked suggestion that they come up with. This is the cognitive equivalent of each of these men taking the time to arrange themselves perfectly in a line so that Zedd can take them out with a single shot from his dissonance-piercing, high-impact cognitive assault bazooka. They willingly offered their reason for mobilization as him having magic, and then willingly offered up a list of impossibly overpowered abilities that someone with magic would have. Zedd tells the men they must be incredibly brave to think that torches and farming tools would be enough to stop someone who could kill them with a look or crack open the earth and swallow them whole. The price that Zedd extracts from them for himself is to make them deal with the cognitive dissonance he creates when he calls them brave for accepting the truths they have given him. Because they are currently blind to evil in themselves, they're unable to admit out loud that they're not brave, even though it is very clear they have every reason to be afraid by their own admission. It's a two-pronged attack. While they're trying to resolve the paradox of the wisdom behind using torches and pitchforks to attack a nearly omnipotent master of the mystic arts, which ultimately must end with the inevitable conclusion of this being a bad idea, they also have to continue to pretend to be brave when their own logic and reason is practically screaming for them that they're being a bunch of morons. Zedd has shifted his status in their eyes from future murder victim to position of authority on all things mystical and unknown. Because they were the ones that decided he has magic, they accept that he must know about magic. Zedd uses this knowledge to invent a list of other terrible things he could do to them, which they hadn't thought of before, deepening their fears even more. Zedd spends so much time building layer upon layer of different reasons to fear him that Richard and Kahlan start to get bored and tired. Which is smoking gun evidence that while Zedd is putting on a master's level clinic on how to do this sort of thing, they were not listening when he told them to pay attention so they could learn something, preferring to shift their weight and be bored until it's over. Zedd sees what he's looking for when the body language of the crowd switches from anger to fear. The group of men announced during their first interactions that a fear of magic is the master they serve. Zedd creates a bigger fear of what he will do to them for being dumb enough to think a wizard would be vulnerable to anything a bunch of farmers and woods guides could do. Once Zedd knows their self-induced fear has made him their new master, he manages to throw his voice in 50 different directions when John says he should let them all go home unharmed, which is exactly what Zedd wanted in the first place. Zedd tells them he's a vengeful wizard who's mad at them for trying to take his most valuable possession from him, his life, and that he will have his vengeance, and he will have his vengeance by taking the thing they value most above all else. The men root around in their pants and collectively discover their manhood has disappeared. They then erupt into what can only be described by the words the author chose, into a three-ring circuit of stooge-related antics. The thing is, I'm not joking. Listen to the following list of things, and you give me one example, read fast in the comments below, that wouldn't also apply to an episode of the Three Stooges. Oh, the thing is, I'm not even joking. Listen to the following list of things, and you give me one example in the comments below that wouldn't also apply to an episode of the Three Stooges. Putting their hands into their pockets, cautiously feeling around. There were moans and wails. Soon the men were all grabbing at their crotches. Pandemonium broke out. Men are jumping up and down, crying, grabbing at themselves, running around in little circles, falling on the ground, asking for help, sobbing, going, nyuk, nyuk, nyuk. Oh, a wise guy, eh? Oh, that last one I scribbled in myself next to my notes. Forget about that one. But all the other ones are a perfect fit. Zedd tells them hit the road and then winks at the camera Richard and Kahlan are standing in front of, clearly pleased with himself. The newly converted 50-man Westland Castrato choir for the advancement of whatever will make the angry wizard give me back my balls tells the angry wizard they will do whatever he wants to make him give them back their balls. Zedd makes them apologize, admit they were acting stupidly, and that the old man was only trying to be their friend, and that Zedd is smarter than they are, much taller, and has the body of a man half his age. Once they apologize, Zedd tells them he'll put things back if they go and tell their families they're being dumb. And they almost made a mistake, and that magic doesn't kill people. Pissed off wizards who are sick of getting the business kill people. With magic. The men leave, but Zedd stops them. He says, look at this mess. Go clean up after yourself and get out of here. And to round out the end of the Stooge parody, the men even run away in cartoon fashion, walking normally and then gradually picking up speed before turning the entire event into an unscheduled flash mob of people running the 200-meter dash. So the big question Richard has after all of this is, how did Zedd make them think their good and plenties had disappeared? Zedd repeatedly claims to have done this without magic. Once the moment is over and they leave, all of traces of Zedd's levity go with them. He calls them idiots and says that their call to action was not called on their own behalf. Zedd reminds Richard that even though it was just a trick, the results are what matter. They are safe and the men got to keep their lives. Zedd determines Darkenral is somehow behind this, but he's made a mistake by not sending enough of a threat to finish the job. Richard asks the question he should have asked back at his cabin early on. Why would Darkenral do this? Because if he's smart enough to orchestrate the event, he must be smart enough to know how to make it succeed. While Richard focuses on what they need to do to prepare for their journey, he's distracted by an odd feeling. Call it intuition or prophecy. Given the language used to describe it, it feels like a minor manifestation of his gift. While he receives the warning from within, much the same as the men are warned when Richard pulls the sword, he decides not to ignore it and begins to assess his situation rationally from all points of view. He considers Zedd's argument that Rahl was lazy and they're too smart to be caught off guard by such a feeble attempt. Richard makes the same conclusion about the series events that I make about the backpack in his house being undisturbed. Richard says this was all part of Darkenral's plan so they would feel safe and confident about how smart they are when he comes in and kills them all in one swoop. When Richard says Darkenral is most likely on his way to kill them right now, Kahlan's eyes are opened, and she confirms everything Richard is thinking is consistent with Darkenral's behavior. Zedd condenses all of the cognitive dissonance generated by this presentation of information into a single swear, and then agrees they need to leave now. Even though Richard tells him they don't have time to think, Zedd says he must grab his rock and runs away to grab it without taking a single moment to engage in a battle of cognitive dissonance with Richard about how much time they do or don't have. Richard goes inside, grabs his pack, confirms the tooth under his shirt, and gives Kahlan a cloak. While he would like to take more, he decides he isn't missing anything that would be worth risking their lives for. Because he didn't waste time arguing, Zedd is already back and waiting for them once Richard and Kahlan are ready to leave. Richard asks Zedd where the rock is, and Zedd tells him it's inside his pocket. When they get ready to leave, Zedd's cat walks up to see them and figure out what's going on. Zedd opens Richard's backpack and tucks the 12-pound furry beast inside. At best, Zedd's cat introduces dirt and other debris to mix with the contents of the backpack. At worst, he's introducing a trace amount of feline fecal matter as well. Given that the current best estimates place the number of apples inside Richard's backpack at 198, this should remind everyone that while I won't tell you what to do, it's always a good idea to wash fresh fruits and vegetables ahead of time. It's also an acceptable choice to know the risks of foodborne illness ahead of time and decide that the amount of effort that would go into offsetting the risk is a bigger waste of life than the problems prevented by the practice. While they're leaving, Richard senses something in the darkness that makes him feel uneasy. He feels like they're being watched from the darkness. Kahlan asks him what's wrong, and Richard is guided by his feelings when he decides it must be his own fear, and he couldn't possibly be anything else, and as a result, he lies to her and says, "Nothing is wrong, let's go." Kahlan accepts the flimsy explanation, which is clearly at odds with the observation her senses are telling her that Richard is troubled by something. While they're traveling away from Zedd's house, they all reflect on the events of the evening. When the author tells us, the cat pokes its head outside of the backpack to look around, and has done so since it was a kitten, we learn that Richard's casual disregard for potential cross-contamination of apples with E. coli goes back at least a dozen years. They move quickly, and after a while Zedd uses some magic dust to cover their trail. Richard asks, what about the cloud? And Zedd says, don't worry about it. A little while later, a giant flame shoots up into the sky, and Zedd says that Darkenral was at his house, and he's being a very poor house guest, wrecking up the place. Kahlan says she's sorry, and Zedd obeys the conservation of cognitive dissonance when he replies that it's okay and it could have been them alongside all of his possessions. Kahlan asks Richard if they know where he's going, and he says he does and leaves it at that. He smiles to himself because this time he's telling the truth. The chapter ends with a cliffhanger as we're given a third-person omniscient view of two flying beasts, passively identified as Gars by their glowing green eyes, rapidly descending towards the three of them to attack from behind. If you like this video and want to make sure that you don't miss the next one, I invite you to take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and enable notifications. I would also invite you to join our Facebook group, the official Seeking the Truth About the Sword of Truth Facebook group. Everyone is welcome, but I need everyone who comes to remember that everyone is supposed to feel welcome. I hope to see you there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.